In this video, we will be developing the Create User Session API, which is also known as logging in. We will be allowing a user to use their username and password they have to create a session. This will return an access token for the requests, and a refresh token for when the access token has expired. This allows you to get a new access token. So let's open up Atom, and you can see here this is our user's controller. What we're going to do is create a new controller to handle the sessions. This will include creating a session, which is known as logging in, deleting a session, which is also known as logging out, and also refreshing a session, which allows us to get a new access token. So the first thing we're going to do is close down this users, right click on controller, create a new file, and we'll call this sessions.php. We'll create the start tag for PHP, and we're going to need to include our database file and our response file, just like we have in the previous controllers. So require once, and this one is the database one, db.php, and require once, and this one we need to navigate to the model, so model/response.php. Now that we've included the files, what we need to do is create the database connection. Just like I've mentioned in previous videos, anything to do with authentication, which includes logging in, create user accounts, logging out, should always be done on the right DB, on the master database. So that's what we're going to try and do. We're going to try and connect to the master database. So anything to do with the database must be within a try and catch statement. So we'll create that now. Try catch PDO exception. And we need to create our error response. So error log, because it's a database connection error, we want to log this for system admins. So error log connection error, and append the exception. And 0 means it goes into the PHP errors log file. So then we'll create our standard response for the error. And then we'll just start filling it out as usual. So response set HTTP status code. And this is a 500 error because we can't connect. And the next thing is response set success, and that's false. Response add message database connection error. Response send, and then exit. Okay, so that's our error handling there. So if we can't connect to the DB, which we'll create now, so we'll call it write DB, connect write DB. So this is our static method from the database class, which is up here. Close that. Okay, I'll save that. Just double check, make sure it all looks all right. Yep, create the database connection. Otherwise, error log. Yep, that all looks okay. So the next thing we need to do, let's create some space, scroll down, is to create our if statements that will select the logic based on the root. So in order to call this API, we're going to be using the /sessions root. Now, there's two things that can happen here. /sessions, which will equal a post request, because this will be used to create a session /login, and there will be /sessions/ and then the session ID. So that could be 3, for example. There'll be 2 of these, so there'll be /sessions/3, and the first one will be delete, and this will be used to log out a user. And there'll be /sessions/3, for example, but this will be a patch. Remember, patch is to update, and we'll use this to refresh a session. So we'll refresh an access token to get a new one. Refresh session. So these are the three things we're going to implement in this sessions file. The first one in this video, we are going to implement the post, which is used to log in / create a session. So we'll be using the /sessions. But what we'll do, we'll put the placeholders in to handle the /sessions / session ID at the same time. If there's something else that's used, so maybe someone will try /sessions / test or something like that, that is invalid. And what we're going to do there is just provide a standard response to say 404, the endpoint's not found, because that's not a valid route. So we'll do that now. We'll get rid of these. So we need to do if, and then we'll use the array key exists. Array key exists. And then we're going to be looking for session ID. And this is within the get. So I'll just create that. So what basically the route is going to translate to once we update our htaccess is something like /sessions.php, and then it'll be something like sessions or session ID equals 3. So that's kind of what it translates to for the one where we do /sessions /3. So that's that check there, and then we'll do a check within this to see whether it is a patch request or a delete request, which will handle the logging out and the refresh of the token. However, in this lesson, the main thing that we're going to do is the next one, which is the else if, and we're going to check to see if the get, so the bit after, so the query string, is empty. So it just contains /sessions, which would be, that maps to just /sessions PHP, which is the file that we're dealing with currently. So check if it's empty, and that is the get. So that handles them too. Like I say, we're not going to be using this one in this lesson, but we will in the next one. In this lesson, we're going to be using this sort of one here. So the other thing we need to do is handle the catch-all, the one if they write /sessions /test, for example. So I'll just get rid of them. So that's just going to be handled by a normal else statement. And what we'll do here, we'll create our standard error response. What I'll do, I'll just copy this one for quickness. Copy, paste. It's not a 500, it's a 404, because /sessions /test, for example, doesn't exist. Endpoint is not found. And that's exactly what we're going to write in this error message. Endpoint not found. So I'll save that. So that's that created. And we're going to concentrate on this lesson in this bit here. So I'm just going to create some space here, so we can now start. So the first thing we need to do here is to make sure that it is only a post request that is handled, because this is /sessions. So this is creation of a session. Remember, we always post to /sessions because we don't know the ID that's generated by the database. So we need to do a check to make sure that it is only a post request, and if it's not, we need to send an error response to say a 405, which is request method not allowed. So for this route, which is /sessions, you wouldn't be allowed to get or delete or patch or something like that. So we'll do that check now. So if server, and it is request method, and then we want to say if it's not equal to post, then we need to send us an error response back. So I'll just copy that to save a bit of time here, because we've written this out millions of times now. And this is going to be a 405 error. And the endpoint not found, we'll change that to request method not allowed. Okay, create some more space, and I'll just save that. So server request method not equal to post, then send an error response. So say it is a post, which is great. The next thing we're going to do is, it's a bit of security here. So what this will do is prevent or help prevent a brute force attack. Now, take example, a brute force attack will keep hitting an endpoint, trying lots of different username and password combinations till it finds one that's successful. Now, this depending on the spec of the server that you have, I mean, if it's just a really small server, it might not be able to handle that many requests at one time. However, if you've got a really sort of powerful server, that server might be able to handle, maybe something like 50, 100 requests per second. Now that basically means that potentially the hacker could try 100 passwords per second. And if you've got a dictionary, with a million, different combinations in, I mean, it's still going to take a long time, don't get us wrong. But by delaying it, and that's what we're going to do here. So what we're going to do for every request that's attempted, we're going to put a delay in of 1 second. Now, 1 second to a normal user that's logging in is not really going to make that much of a difference. However, by delaying a potential hacker by 1 second will make a massive difference. Instead of being able to, submit 50 to 100 requests per second, we're going to now limit this down to 1 per second. So if they've got 1 million, that's over at least a million seconds, to try or, try every combination in the dictionary. So, something that's not really, visible to the end user, we're going to put this in and it just makes the system more secure. Now, the way we do that is we use a function called sleep. And then it takes a parameter and it's basically how many seconds. So we're just going to say sleep for 1 second. So as it tries to post, as it runs through this code, it first checks the post and then immediately it's going to sleep or hold for 1 second. Then it's going to carry on doing, its normal checks. So by just introducing that delay there, I wouldn't recommend really much more than 1 second, maybe 2 seconds maximum. But, you don't want to, every time a user logs in, you don't want them waiting, 10 or 15 seconds for the login to work. People will lose patience and use a different system. They'll lose they'll lose patience with your system. So after we've introduced that sleep for 1 second, the next thing we need to do, we need to check that the content type that's submitted in the request body, because they need to submit obviously a username and password as this request. Now, obviously, in the previous lessons, we checked the content types being JSON, and that's exactly what we're going to do here, because this API and this whole course is dealing exclusively with JSON. So if we do the check now, so check, and then it is _server, and then it is content type. So it's content _type, and if it's not, application /JSON, then it's going to be another error message or error response. So I'll copy this one, paste it in there, and this is going to be a 400 error because it's a client error. They haven't submitted, correct JSON, or the content type's not JSON. And then we're just going to change the message to content type header not set to JSON. And we've done this in the previous videos. Okay, the next thing we need to do is get the JSON and then try and or make sure that it is valid JSON for a start. So just by setting the content type doesn't necessarily say that's valid JSON. So we need to check that now. So we need to get it, sorry. So we need raw post data, and then we need to use the file get contents. I can spell, and then it is the PHP input. Oops. So it's PHP input. So we'll get that as raw post data, and then what we're going to do is an if statement, and we've done this in the previous videos. where we decode it and check to make sure that the decode statement hasn't returned false. So we'll do that now. So if we need to check that it's not false. So JSON data, so JSON decode, and then we'll pass in the raw post data. Let's scroll down a bit. We use obviously the JSON decode statement here, pass in the raw post data, which it gets from the request body. Stores it in this variable if it's successful. Otherwise, it returns false if it's not valid JSON. And then we're going to send a standard error response back. Copy and paste that. So new response, still a 400 message. However, the message is now going to change to request body is not valid JSON. Okay, so at this point down here, hopefully, scroll down, we should have some valid JSON data. So now what we need to do is do our data validation checks to make sure the manager fields that must be sent with this request are passed in. Now the only two fields that you're passing in here is a username and password because we're logging in. So we just need to make sure that them exist in the request body. So we'll do that check now. So if, and then what we need to do is set and JSON data, and it'll be username. And then it'll be or if it doesn't exist. So if it is set JSON data password. So what we're doing here is username from the JSON data. Make sure it's set. If not, so that's what the if statement's doing. It's an error handler. Or if the password's not set. So in essence, that's what we're doing. If the username's not set or if the password's not set, because both of these are mandatory for this request, we're going to send back an error response. So we'll copy that one, paste in there. And this time it's 400 error message, exactly the same. But this time we're going to use the ternary operator again to say, well, username is not supplied or the password's not supplied, depending on what we're doing. So I'm just going to create some space here and need to put it in brackets. And then what we're going to do is just use this bit here as the check. So is set JSON data username. So we're saying, I'll just create some space. So we're saying if username is not set, then, remember, question mark, then we will send this message back. So I'm just going to copy that. Well, I'm going to cut it actually, I'm going to move it and put it there. Get rid of the semicolon, change the message itself, and we'll change this to username not supplied. And then what we do here is after that we do a else, otherwise, basically, return false. So if we get rid of the white space and add a semicolon at the end, this is our basically one-liner if statement. So if username is not set, then add the message username not supplied. Otherwise, just return false. So I'm just going to get rid of that white space, and then I'm going to copy this line and paste it just underneath. And then what we're going to do is change the username to password, and then change this message to password. So now obviously this one is saying if password is not supplied, then add a message to say password's not supplied. So on your request, if you don't supply a username, you will get this message returned as an error response. If you don't supply a password, you will get this message. However, if you don't supply either, you will get both of these messages. So username not supplied, password not supplied. So that's our quick check there. The next check we're going to do is just to make sure that it's within its parameters. So for example, it must have, it must be greater than 0 in length. There must be some value there for username and password, but they must both be less than 255 characters long, or maximum of 255 characters. So that's what we're going to do now. So I'll press enter, do an if statement. So the first thing we need to do is use the strlen function again. I'm just going to create some space here just so we can see. So string length, and it is JSON data, and then it was username. So if the length of the username is less than 1, so for example, if the username doesn't have a value in it, then what we'll do, we'll create an error response. However, there's obviously more than just the username, and there's more than one check we need to do on this data. So the next check we need to do is OR, and then string length again, strlen, and then it's JSON data, username. And then we're going to say, well, if it's greater than 255 characters, well, we also want to send an error. The other thing we need to do, obviously we're checking the username and the password, so we need to do another OR with the two pipes. strlen, JSON data, password. Make sure it's, greater than 0 in length. So if it's less than 1, so that means it's 0, we obviously need to see an error response or return an error response. Or the next one is strlen, and then it's JSON data, password. If it's greater than 255 characters, we're also returning an error message. So just going to get rid of this white space because that's our conditions there. So we're saying, if the username is less than 1, so if it's blank, or if the username is greater than 255, which is the maximum amount of characters, or if the password is less than 1, so if the password's blank, or if the password's greater than 255 characters, then we're going to send an error message back. So I'm just going to copy this one here, copy that, paste. So the check here is obviously the standard response. It's a 400 error, and we're going to sort of send multiple messages back depending on what's wrong. So I guess what we need to do here is change this beginning bit for this bit here. So that's the check in this case. So strlen, and it was JSON data username. And we're saying if it was less than 1, then we'll add the message and we'll say username cannot be blank. I'm just going to delete this one here because we're going to use this as a basis. So the length of the username must be greater than 0, otherwise false. Username cannot be blank. Okay. So I'm just going to copy that, paste it here, let's indent that slightly. So the next check is obviously this one here. So if it's greater than 255, so if we just change the condition here, we're still dealing with the username. So if it's greater than 255, then instead of being blank, we'll just say username must be less than 255 characters. Okay. And what we're going to do is just copy these two lines because we need to do exactly the same for password. So we'll check the JSON data password and then password beneath that as well. So the first one checks to see if the password's blank. If it is, we will send back password cannot be blank. Otherwise, if it's greater than 255 characters, we'll say password must be less than 255 characters. Okay, we'll save that. So that's kind of the check on the validation of the data. The next thing we need to do is to query the database to see if we can find a valid user for the passed in username. At this point, we're not checking the password because we need to return the user row for the passed in username. Because there's a couple of different checks we need to do. For example, if the user account's active or if the account's locked out, that sort of thing. So the first thing we need to do is to retrieve, hopefully, a row based on a valid username. So the same with any other database connection or query, we need to put it in a try and catch statement. So we'll do try, and catch, and it's a PDO exception, and it's EX. And then what we need to do is send a response back. So we will log this in the error log. Actually, no, we won't, because it may be the case that because they're passing in a username and password in plain text, and I'll show you how to verify that against the hashed version in the database, we're actually not going to log the exception error in a plain text file, which is the error log. So it's not good practice to do that, because if someone gets access to the server, then they could read potential log files and see passwords in plain text. So actually we're not going to do that. We're just going to send a standard response back. So response, new response, new response, and then response set HTTP status code, and it's a 500 error because something went wrong with a database query. And then response set success, and that is false. And then it was response, response, and then it was add message, and the message is there was an issue logging in. I think that's okay. Generic enough not to cause a security threat, but enough information to the user. And then response send, and then exit. Okay, so that's our try and catch statement there. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to get rid of this white space just to bring that up a bit, because we're not dealing with outside of that at the moment. And I'm going to create some white space here just so we can see what we're doing. Okay, so now that we've got our try and catch statement, we need to now create the query that'll, try and return a row from the database. So username equals JSON data username, and password equals JSON data password. Okay, so we'll store these in the variables. So the passed in username and password from the JSON in the request body, we'll store in variables. So if we create that query now, and then it was the right DB, and then it was pre-pair, and then the SQL query that we're going to write is basically we're selecting everything out of the TBL users database table where the username equals the passed in username. Like I say, we're not doing anything with the password yet. We'll come to that in a second. So select ID, full name, username, password. What was the other ones? It was user active and login attempt, wasn't it? From TBL users, where username equals, and its placeholder, username. Okay, so because username, we set a condition on the, a constraint on the database to say the username must be unique. So we should only get a maximum of one row here anyway. We could have 0 rows, so the username doesn't exist, but the maximum one, is 1 row. So run that query. We need to bind the parameter query, bind param, and then it is username, and bind that with username, and it is PDO param string. So it's a string parameter, and then we need to query execute. So this will run the database query now, and what we need to do is get a row count, and that is query row count. It should be 1 or 0 basically. So row count, and then we need to do the check. So if the row count is equal to 0, that basically means that there's no user exists in the system for the passed in username. And that's exactly what we're going to say. So it's a response. So we'll copy this response here and paste it there. So the response is not a 500 error. It's a 401, which is unauthorized basically. You know, there's no username or password, so the details you've attempted are incorrect. So you'd return a 401 error code, which is unauthorized. We'll change the message here to username or password is incorrect. So what we'll never do when we're dealing with security is give very specific answers to what's wrong, because that could allow a potential hacker to work out based on, you know, logic of what's right and what's wrong. We try and obscure any error messages that we send back. You know, not really error messages. I guess it's any messages that we send back. So in essence, what's the matter here is that the username that's being given doesn't exist. So the user doesn't exist. But we don't want to tell the user that. We just want to say username or password is incorrect. Even though we're not checking the password, like I say, we're just giving a generic message back to the user. So what I'll do now, in theory, that's if it doesn't exist. So if it does exist, we need to fetch the row back. So because we're only dealing with one row, we're not going to use a while. So we'll do row, and then it is query, and then it is fetch. Normally, we obviously would do this part in a while statement, but there's only ever going to be 1 or 0 rows. So we'll just do it here. Fetch, and then it was PDO, fetch associative array, basically. Okay, so now that we've got that, what we need to do is to store each of these values here in variables. So what we'll do is, so obviously it's the ID, so returned ID, and that is row ID. And then the next one is returned full name, and that's row full name. And then returned username, and that's row username. I'm basically prefixing these so I know what is, you know, a passed in value and what is a returned value. So returned full name, username, and then it was password. Row password. And then returned, the next one was user active. User active. The next one's returned login attempts. So that's login attempts. EMPTS, yeah. Right, so we've got each of these values from the query: ID, full name, username, password, user active, login attempts, ID, full name, username, password, user active, and login attempts. Right, we need to do some validation on this row. So the first thing we need to do is the user active. So if they've got a Y, then great. If it's not a Y, so the user's not active, we need to send an error response back to say this user's not active, and that's the end of that. The same with login attempts. Now what we're going to do further down this script is to increment this number. Remember, a login attempt starts at 0, and we're going to lock it out if it's got 3 or more, basically, attempts at logging in. Now we're not dealing with the unlocking of it or anything like that. At the moment, there'll be, an access to the database where a user will update the value back to 0 or this back to Y if, you know, we need to enable an account. We're not dealing with that side of it. So what we need to do here is do an if statement, and we need to check returned user active, and we need to say, well, is this a, if it's not a Y, then we need to send a response back. So we'll copy that, paste that in there. It's a 401 error because it's still an unauthorized error. It's still a user access error. And then we'll just change this message to user account not active. And that's fine. So we'll return that if it's not Y, user account not active. Okay, the next check we need to do, like I say, is to count the number of login attempts. So returned login attempt. And what we want to say is if this is greater than or equal to 3. We'll never just say that it's 3, because if somehow, for any reason, you know, the number is 4, 5 or something like that, if we just basically said if it was equal to 3, this check wouldn't work. So we're saying if it's greater than or equal to 3, the user is locked out of their account and they need a resetting. So we're just going to copy this message and put it here. Still a 401 error. And here we are going to change this to user account is currently locked out. These type of error messages is okay. You just don't want to say, well, your username's correct, but your password's wrong, or the password's correct, but the username's wrong. You know, you don't want to give that detail. You just want to say, well, the user account's not active, or the user account is locked out. Don't give any way, you know, anything away with, you know, is that a correct username? Is it not? That sort of thing. Okay, now that we've done our checks on our user to make sure that, you know, they're not locked out and that you're active, the next thing we need to do is to validate the password is the same password, word for word, uppercase for uppercase, you know, special character for special character, is the same as the passed in one. But because our password is hashed in the database, we need to use the PHP function called password_verify. Now, if you remember in our create users route, we created obviously the password or hashed the password using the password_hash function. So what we need to do here, a password can never be unhashed. That's important to know. You know, you can't convert it back to a plain text password. The only thing you can do is pass in a plain text value and check it does like a verify based on the hash. So you can never, you know, convert it back to plain text. You always sort of do a one-way hashing. So what we need to do is use the password_verify function, you know, and that returns a true or false. So that's the check we need to do. So we need to do an if, and then if it's false, so it means if the password is incorrect, we need to do two things. We need to update the login attempts to increment the login attempts number. So if it's currently on 0, that will go to 1. You know, if it's currently on 1, that will go to 2. So that's the first thing we need to do. The next thing we need to do is obviously return the error response back to say the username or password is incorrect. So we'll do the password verify first. So if it is returned false, so password verify, it takes two parameters. The first one is the plain text password that's passed in our request body up here. So within the JSON data, it's this password here. So we'll pass in the plain text password, so password. And the next parameter is the returned password. So this is the hash of the password that, you know, that's stored in the database. So returned password. So if the verify function returns false, so the passwords don't match, the password is incorrect, then we need to update the user login attempts and then send the error response back. So we need to create a database query, so query, and then it'll be write_db, and then it'll be prepare, and then it'll be update, so it'll be update TBL users, and we need to set login attempts to current value plus 1. So login attempts plus 1, where ID equals, and then it'll be ID. So it's a placeholder. So an ID is, remember, is not a username. It's the sequential number that's generated from the database because it's a auto increment primary key. So we're not doing that based on username. We're just doing it on user ID. So what this is doing here is to set that row for this username. We're incrementing the login attempts by 1. So it takes its current value and then pluses 1 to that. So we need to bind the parameter. Query bind param, and then it is ID, and that is, we'll pass in the returned ID. And then this is PDO param integer. And then we need to do query execute. So because we're already within a try and catch statement here, we're fine if this, errors, because it'll catch it here anyway. So that's okay. Okay, so that's updated the login attempts by 1. We now need to send our response back. So I'll just copy this and then paste it there. And then it is a 401 error still. And then we're going to change the message to the generic username or password is incorrect. Get rid of this white space. Save that. So you can see here that if the passwords don't match, so the password's not the same as the one that was originally set in the database, we update that user login attempt. So this is how obviously password lockouts work. You use the wrong password, it increments that, and after so many attempts, your user account gets locked out. So we'll set that, and then we'll send our response back. So the next thing we need to do, so say the password does match. So, we're progressing through the login stage here. Obviously all this is invisible to the client. This is just sequential code that runs, does your checks and logs you in basically. So that's sort of the last check we need to do there. The next thing we need to do is now create the access token and the refresh token. So to do that, we're going to generate some random text or, random characters to then return to the client, because the access token doesn't, it doesn't mean anything. It is just random characters. So the first thing we need to do, we're going to use a function called open SSL random sudo PS, make sure I spell this right because I always spell it wrong, AUDO, yeah, that looks right, bytes, and we're going to generate a value that is 24 bytes long. You can create this, I wouldn't say as long as you want, but within reason. 24 is a good starter. It makes it, quite a big access token anyway. I would probably leave it at that if I'm being honest. So we'll use openSSL underscore random underscore sudo underscore bytes. This is an SSL command, openSSL. And what this does is generate random characters, or random bytes I should say, it's not really characters at this point, securely. So what this will do, it'll just make sure that it is a value that hasn't been used before, that sort of thing. It has its own algorithm to make sure that it is securely generating, some sort of value for you. But because it's bytes, we need to convert that to hexadecimal, and then we need to base 64 encode that to give us a character string that we can pass in and out an HTTP header request. Because in the end, that's where we're going to use this access token. So the first thing we need to do is convert it to hexadecimal. So we'll use the bin2 hex. So we'll wrap this function in that. So that converts binary, which, because we're dealing with bytes, that's what we're doing, to hexadecimal. And then in order to generate some, readable characters for us, a code, we wrap that in a base 64 encode. And this allows you to pass it in as an HTML header. It uses, an HTTP header. It uses valid characters, nothing, nothing strange, nothing massive. It just creates a nice string for you to use and pass in an HTTP header. So now that we've got that, the next thing we need to do, which is something I always do, we'll take the scenario of, a user has an access token stored on their client device. Now, that should be somewhere secure on the device, and your client is responsible for making sure that value is secure. However, if the user has not used their device in a long time, where potentially someone else in the system may have that same access token. Now, we put a unique clause on the access token in the database. However, if our access tokens changed or expired, and it's good practice to remove sessions that haven't been used or have expired and the refresh tokens expired, if someone's got what's called a stale token sitting on their device, and the chance of this has happened is really, really rare. To be honest, it's probably not worth worrying about. But to make sure this is guaranteed to be unique and that no one else can have this access token stored on their device, we suffix it with the time. So we add the time onto the value that's returned. So you might get something like, I don't know, something like that returned. We then add the unique time onto that. And the time function is the epoch code, or, numbers, basically the Unix time from 1970, onto the end of that. So every second that will increase. So the chances of having a stale token that matches somebody's randomly unique token in the database, because obviously our session's now being cleared, so someone else could potentially, which, like I say, would never really happen, but could potentially have that same token. And because ours is stale on the device, because the user hasn't used it or opened the app for, 30 days or 40 days or whatever, potentially, someone else the system might have generated the same code for a different user. So to guarantee uniqueness, we always put the time on that. So I'll just get rid of that. So what we'll do now is to save this in a variable. So we'll call this access token, and then semicolon at the end. So we're converting that. So that's how we generate an access token. And you'll be able to see that later on in the video, what it looks like. And what we're going to do now, we're going to generate a refresh token exactly the same way. So refresh token, and it's exactly the same amount of characters. So by generating this and calling it again there, it won't be the same token. Even if it is, it doesn't really matter, but it won't be. So refresh token and access token. So they are our two tokens that we create. Then what we're going to do is, create an expiry time in seconds. So access token, expiry second, so people know what it is when they read the code. And we're going to set this to 1200, which is 20 minutes. So the access token will last 20 minutes before it's expired. You'll then have to provide the refresh token to generate yourself a new access token. But the refresh token will also expire after so long. So refresh token, expiry seconds. And what we're going to use here is something like 1.2 million. So it's basically 14 days. So 1209600. I worked this out prior to this, prior to recording. So this amount of seconds equals 14 days. So the refresh token will stay valid for 14 days. And what this allows you to do, if a user hasn't logged in within 14 days, it expires. But if someone logs in, 13 days, we can still get it. So it won't log you out, basically. So now that we've got that looks okay. And there's a couple of things we need to do next. So I'm just going to get rid of this white space here. So that's the try and catch for that. Now, what we're going to do next is create a new try and catch, because once we've got to this point here, this is a successful login. We haven't quite returned anything back to the user, but what we need to do is to reset the login attempt counter back to 0. So when there has been a successful login, then we reset login attempt back to 0. This is how it works, in other systems. If you've tried twice, to log in incorrectly, and then all of a sudden you've managed to get in okay, that resets your login attempt back to 0. So you get 3 new tries before it locks you out. The reason why we're putting this in a try and catch is because we're going to perform 2 different database updates. The first one is to obviously reset the login attempts back to 0, but also to insert a new row into the TBL sessions table that we created. So this obviously is what records the, you have a session active for that user. Now what we want to do, if one of those updates or one of those, insert an update fails, one of those queries, we need to catch that. But then what we do is roll back. So, the first thing we might do, the first query is to update the TBL users table to to reset the login attempts. However, if there's then a problem, inserting something into the TBL sessions, we want to what's called a rollback. We want to roll back any updates to any table that we've done, because we need to handle the error and leave the login attempts and leave the data as it was before the error. So that's why we do a separate try and catch. Because at the minute, this doesn't warrant. We're only doing sort of one update in this sort of logic here. Yes, we're selecting from the database, but we're only doing one update. So because there's multiple updates included in this next one, we need to wrap this in a new try and catch statement. So it goes directly after the catch. So I'll just make some space here. And we need to create a new try and catch. And it's a PDO exception. And that is X, yep. And then scroll down. I'm just going to create that white space there because we know where we are now. And we need to create the logic for the catch. So what we're going to do is just copy this response here, which is the error response. So instead of using 404, it's going to be a 500 error because the database error has occurred. And we're going to write something like there was an issue logging in. Please try again. Because we got so far, but then obviously something's happened with the database or something like that. So what we need to do in the catch was what I'm saying about the rollback. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to write the code here, then I'll explain it when we get to this point. But it'll be write db and then it's rollback. And like I say, I'll come back to this. It's actually roll capital back. Yeah. And I'll come back to this. Okay, so in our try, because we're using a rollback, we need to create something called a database transaction. A transaction is what's known as atomic. So it means that if you're performing multiple database queries, they all have to succeed before the data is saved into the database. Now, if there's an error halfway through, that's what this catch statement will catch. And the rollback basically means put it back to the point before you've actually updated anything. So it returns the data back to unmodified if there's an error with one of the queries. So what we need to do is create the transaction. So that's write db, and the function's called begin transaction. Oops. Can it spell? Transaction. And then we create our database queries as normal. So the first thing we need to do, so query, and then it was write db, and then prepare. So the first thing we need to do, like I say, is update the login attempts to set it back to 0 for the user. So it's update TBL users, and then it's set login attempts to 0, where ID equals ID. And then we need to bind the parameter. So bind param, and then it was ID, ID, and then it was returned, remember, the returned ID, and that was PDO param int, it's an integer, and then we need to execute it. So that's query execute. Yep, so we've got the prepare. Yeah, that looks fine. So it first attempts to do that. The next thing we need to do is now insert into the TBL sessions table. So this is what records your sessions. So query, and it was write DB, and then it was prepare, and then it would be insert into TBL sessions, and the fields will be not username, so it would be user ID, and then access token, and then access token expiry, refresh token, and refresh token expiry. So remember, in our database table for TBL sessions, if I just go back to here, TBL sessions, just go back to here, and then we've got ID. The user ID is the internal ID for the user. So because we have that, we already returned that from the users, TBL users table, and then we're storing the access token, the expiry, the refresh token, and the refresh token expiry. So if we go back to Adam, so we'll insert them, and then we need to put the values in. So we'll write values, and then in brackets, I'm just going to create some space here so we can see what we're doing. The first one would be a placeholder for user ID, and then access token, and then it was the access token expiry. But what we need to do now is to get the current date time and add the amount of seconds to it. So we use the MySQL date add function. So date add, and then we use now, which is the current date time, and then we use the interval, and the interval is the amount of seconds. So access token expiry seconds that we're going to pass in second. So we use this function to, I mean, that will be getting substituted with something like 1200, for example, which is 20 minutes. But it takes the time now and it adds 1200 seconds to it. So that's the refresh token, the access token expiry. We now need to do the same for refresh token. So, comma, this will be the refresh token. Refresh token, and then we're going to use this date add function again. So we'll copy that, paste it. So we're going to be adding, instead of access token, we're going to add refresh token expiry seconds. I think that should be it for that. So we'll get rid of this white space. Just scroll back, and then, so that's user ID, access token, the expiry, the refresh token, and the refresh token expiry. And these are obviously placeholders at the moment. So it's going to do a calculation on the current time and add the amount of seconds that we're going to pass in for the access token expiry, and the same for the refresh token expiry. So that's what we need to do now. We need to bind these parameters. So query bind param, and the first one is not that, so user ID, and that, remember, was the returned user ID that we got out of the database for TBL users. And then that was PDO param integer, because it's a number. So the next one, query bind param, and this is for the access token. So because we've generated that up here, we can utilize that variable. So bind param, and then this was access token, and then we're going to bind access token, and this is a string, so it's PDO param str. And the next thing we need to do is query bind param, and this is access token expiry. I'll just move along, make sure that's what I called it. So access token expiry seconds is what I called it. So expiry seconds, and then that one that we're passing here is this value here. So because we sort of created a variable to store that in, we'll just use that variable. So access token expiry seconds, and it was PDO param, and it was an integer. Okay, scroll down, and then the next one, query bind param, and this one is for the refresh token. We'll store the refresh token up here after it was generated. It was PDO param string query bind param, and it was refresh token expiry seconds, and we stored that also in a variable just here, refresh token expiry seconds, 1.2 million. So that was refresh token expiry seconds, and that was PDO param int. Okay, so now that we've bound that, we need to execute it. So query execute, and then that's fine. So what we need to do now is to get the unique session ID, because you use the session ID. The client should know what that is, because that's what they'll be using with the /sessions/ and then a number, 34 or 6 or something like that. That is the auto-generated session ID, and they'll be using that route there to log out. So they'll be using a delete /sessions/6, for example, or when they refresh it, they'll need to know the session ID. So we need to return that back to the client so they can then use that. So the way that we get that, we've used this previously, is to use the database connections last insert ID function, and we need to store that because we need to return it. So we'll call that last session ID, and we use the right DB. Remember, it's not the query that we call this on, it's the last connection for the database. So that, and then it was last insert ID. So that gets us our last ID. So we'll keep that. So now what we want to do, and we haven't used this yet, but because scroll up, because we've done this in a transaction, we need to commit this data. So the commit saves the data to the database, because we're starting a transaction. It does this bit, but it doesn't save the data. What it does is hold this in a session, if you know what I mean. It's like a transaction. It says do this and this, but don't save it in the database for everyone else that can get access to it until you commit it. So we run a commit. So write db, and that is a commit. So that saves the data in the database. So now, because it's saved, hopefully we haven't hit this point, because that, commit and rollback, the rollback will take you back to what the values were before these ran. So it does a bit of a restore to a backup, that type of thing, although it's a little bit more complicated than that. So after the commit, now we need to send the user the access token and the access token expiry seconds and the session ID in a response. So the way we do that, we've done this many times before. We'll create some return data. So return data, create an array, and then return data, and then the first one will be session ID, and that'll be the last session ID. So because we want to return this as a number, we have to wrap this in int val, because when we get it back here, it doesn't really know what type of data it is. So we need to explicitly say that it's an integer value, it's a number. So last session ID. So that's the session ID that's been generated from the insert. We return this back to the user as a session ID. Return data. And then what we need to do here is access token. So, and that is the access token there. So that's the one that we generated. And we need to pass back how many seconds it expires in. So we don't return the date and time that it expires in. We return the number of seconds that it expires in. So we store it in a date and time format because we do a check to see what the current time is and if the session, the access token has expired or not. But all we pass back to the client is the number of seconds that it will expire in. It's up to that to do the check or, whatever they need to do. So return data. So we need to access token expires in, and you should always return seconds. You shouldn't really return a date and time, just return seconds. And this was access token expiry seconds. So now we need to do exactly the same thing but for the refresh token. Return data, refresh token, and then it is refresh token, and then return data, refresh token, expires in, refresh token expiry in seconds. Okay, now we scroll down a bit and we'll create our standard response, but this one obviously is a successful one because we've logged in. We've got to this point here, everything's fine, we've got our access token, we've created our session in the table, and we just need to return these details to the user so they can use that on future requests to access our tasks API. Because like I say, we're dealing with our authentication type API at the moment. So response, new response, and create a response. So we'll set HTTP status code, and what we're going to do here is a 201 because this is a created. 201's created. We've created a session, which means we've logged in. So response set success, and it's true for once. We'll always deal with the false, but this time it's true. And what we're going to do is set the data. So response set data, and we'll pass in the return data, which is the values here. And then what we're going to do is send. You could add a message, but why? We know we've logged in because we've got an access token. So we'll just send and then exit. Okay, get rid of this white space and we'll save that. Okay, we're nearly there, we can nearly test it. What we need to do now is go back to our htaccess file and create the rewrite rule that converts, sessions.php into /sessions. So if I quickly go into htaccess, and we've got tasks here and users here. If we create a new one, rewrite rule, and then create our sort of users. So this time it'll be sessions, so it'll be /sessions, that's fine. And this maps to controller /sessions.php and put it as a last rule. We'll be doing another one in the next video that'll handle the sessions / and then a number, which will be very similar to this. So tasks / and then the number, and that'll be mapping to, remember earlier on in the video when I said it's, session ID equals and then a number. That's what we're mapping to, but that's for the next video. At the moment, just to test this, it's just the rewrite rule for sessions, and that points to sessions.php. So we'll make sure that's saved. Go back to sessions, and I think we should have everything in here now. Just scroll back up the top. I'm just going to double check everything. Create a database connection. We're not dealing with /sessions /session ID at the moment. That's in the next video. So we'll deal with just /sessions. We'll make sure it's a post request. If not, send an error. We'll add the delay in to hopefully try and prevent brute force attacks. We'll make sure it's application JSON that's sent. We'll get that JSON. We'll make sure that it is valid JSON data. We'll do a check to make sure the mandatory username and password are there. We'll make sure that the values provided, don't exceed the limit. So we'll make sure it does have a value and make sure it's not greater than 255 characters. We'll then try and query the database based on the username to make sure the user exists, because we need to pull back the password and all that sort of stuff. So we do the select. We save these values from the row into temporary variables. Do checks on these variables to make sure the user is active. We'll make sure that the user is not currently locked out. We'll then do a password verify using the password verify function. Username, the clear text password here, and the returned password, which is the hashed password. This function does the comparison to do the check to make sure the passwords match. If it doesn't match, we update or increment login attempts from the current value to +1. So if it's at 1, it's now 2. We'll then go down. So if it has been successful and the passwords match, we'll create our access tokens, create some secure bytes, 24 bytes. We'll then convert that to hex, because you can't go direct to base 64. We'll have to do an intermediary. We append the time on the end to provide guaranteed uniqueness. We basically do the same for the refresh token. We add the amount of seconds. And then what we do is we do another try and catch statement, which allows us to build up a transaction to allow us to perform multiple queries. And if one of these fail, it puts the data back the way it was before it done any of the queries, which, this sets the login attempts to 0, creates the session and inserts the session in the table so we can then validate against that. We'll get the last insert ID, which is a session ID to send back to the client. We'll then add this in a standard success response, session ID, access token, the expiries, and we'll send that back. We'll catch any issues, do a rollback if needed because we're in a transaction, and handle an endpoint not found if it's not /sessions or if it's not /sessions/1. So that's a lot of detail in there. So the exciting bit now is where we test it. So what I'm going to do is open up Safari, because this is where PHP My Admin is. Now at the minute, we don't have any sessions in the table, but we do have users. Created that test user in there. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to delete this user because, to be honest, I can't remember what the password was now. So we'll run through creating a user and then logging in as the user. So I'm just going to delete that user. So we don't have any users, so we'll have to create a user. So if we go to Postman, and it's going to be a post because we need to create a user first. So this is like a user signing up to your application. So HTTP, and then it is localhost port 8888/v1/users. Remember, we're dealing with sessions in this video, but we need to create a user first. So we've obviously implemented this in a previous video. We'll go to body, and then it's raw, and then it's application JSON. Create the JSON, and it needs the fields to create a user was full name, and I'm just going to say Michael Jones, and then it was username, so we're just going to call that Michael J for a username. I'll just call it Michael actually, just for simpleness. And the password, we're just going to say that is password123. So hopefully this should create a user. So we'll send that. Scroll up. So we've got our user, Michael Jones, username is Michael, and the password obviously I picked is password123. Just going to leave that there. So now what we'll do, we'll try and log in using our new session sort of endpoint. So I'm just going to try a GET request to begin with because I want to make sure the logic's working for that initial check to make sure that it's only handling a POST request. So HTTP localhost, and then it's 8888/v1/sessions. So I'll send that. So request method's not allowed because it's a GET request. That's fine. So that proves that that bit of logic's working. So I'm just going to go to post. So it's /sessions. So send. And you'll now see content type header is not a set of JSON. That's fine. So that check's also working. Go to the body. Raw. Application JSON. Send that. I'm expecting an error. Request body is not valid JSON. So that's right. So we've moved on to the next step. So that logic's working. So now what we'll do is we will do the check to make sure it's looking for mandatory values. So you can see there, username not supplied and password's not supplied. That's fine because it's not. So username, and it was Michael. I'm just going to send that. There you go, password not supplied. So you can see that that logic's working. So now I'll supply a password which initially is going to be incorrect. So I'm just going to write password, even though our password's 123. Well, it's password123. So I'll send that. So you can see there it's a 401 error, success is false, and username or password is incorrect. Now I'm just going to go back to phpMyAdmin, go to the users table and click browse. So you can see our user that we've just created before, the hashed password, the user's active, and you can see the login attempts is now 1 because we've just attempted an incorrect password. So now if I go back to Postman and just attempt that again, username and password is incorrect, that's fine. Go back to phpMyAdmin, refresh that, and login attempts is now 2. That's also fine because it's incrementing the number. I'll go back to Postman and send it again. Username and password is incorrect. Go to browse, we're at 3. Now the account's locked out, remember, because we put that check in. So even if we type in the right password this time, so Michael and password123, send, you can see now the user account is currently locked out. So even though the details are right, my account is locked out. So now if I go back to here, click browse, you can see that it doesn't increment anymore because 3 is the lockout. I'm just going to change this to be 0 again because now I want to test the success side of it. So that's basically unlocking the account. I mean, I could check the user active, so I'll change that Y to an N. So we can say the user is not active. So that's Y to an N now. just a quick check. Even though it's the right username, right password, it's, you know, the check's working, the user account is not active. So as a quick fix for this, I'm just going to say yes, user account is active. So now we should be able to log in successfully. We've tested all the other logic, that's working. So now if we just send this request, you can see now it's 201, which is a created. So we've created a session, it's true, no messages. We've returned the session ID, which is the unique session ID that's in the table that's generated automatically. We have an access token. So you can see here that it's a, you know, it's a random code, got uppercase, lowercase letters in. And if you look at the seconds, we return that. And then this is the refresh token. So you can see this is different. And the number of seconds there. Now you can see that this token here, you know, you would never guess that. It's that random, you would never guess it. This is the token, or this is the value that will be sent in every HTTP request against our task API. So this is kind of your password. And this will be sent with every request. And this will only last 20 minutes, we set it to. 1200 seconds. So it's 20 minutes. Once that expires, we will have to then send a patch request to /sessions/1, which in the next couple of videos we'll be sorting that out, to get a new access token. So if I go back to phpMyAdmin and go into table sessions, TBL sessions, browse, you can see we have a session now recorded in the database. So we've got the session ID, the user ID, which matches the user's user ID, the access token expiry. So you can see that that is when the token will expire, the refresh token, and the refresh token expiry. So in this video, we've allowed a user now to log in based on valid user credentials. In the next video, what we'll be doing is allowing a user to log out. And what that entails is deleting this row from this table. So removing this session basically. So I'll see you in the next video.